Welcome to part 4 of the set of presentations on Helicobacter pylori. In this fourth part, we're going to look at the epidemiology of Helicobacter pylori infections. So the first point of 5 points to make here is that prevalence is best correlated with socio-economic status. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you look at the map here, you can quite clearly see that if you look to developing or third world countries, you can see that the incidence of pylori infection is much, much higher compared to in developed countries, and in island nations you tend to see even lower rates of infection unless that country is a developing nation. So pylori is common in terms of its epidemiology, and so it's a common pathogen, and some estimates say that up to 50% of the world's population are infected. So that's an average. If you obviously on the map here you see some 80s and 90s and 70s, but if you take the world's population as a whole and you look at an average, then about 50% of the world's population are infected. Now that's not to say that 50% of the world's population are running around with duodenal ulcers, peptic ulcers and gastric cancers, and so is what we obviously deduce from this is that many people live completely asymptomatically and have no disease associated with the presence of the pathogen. So there's a little bit of a debate regarding whether it's necessary to eliminate the pathogen from those people, and there's even some research now which shows that elimination of the pathogen in otherwise healthy patients can actually have some adverse effects. So that's the first point to make here, is that the prevalence of the infection best correlates with socioeconomic status. And the last point to add here is really that most of these infections occur in these high prevalence areas in the early years of childhood. Okay, so moving on to the second point here. The second main point here regarding epidemiology of pylori is that the older you get, the more likely you are to become infected. That'll become obvious in a moment when we talk about the routes of transmission. That is how you pick up the pathogen. So there's a significant increase in the chance of infection with increasing age, and so you can see that's very, very different with developing countries versus developed countries. You see from the graph here, the red line being developing countries, the blue line being developed countries, and if you're having problems being colorblind, then the blue line is the dashed line. So you can see that in developing countries, the rates of infections are very, very high. You may get up to 80% infection rates by the time an individual is 20, so that means 80% of 20-year-olds would be infected. Maybe I'm off on my lines there, maybe 80% of people at age 30 are infected. But you can see that your risk increases with age, that's risk of infection. There's also a higher incidence in immigrant populations, so in immigrants from certain parts of Latin America, the infection rate can be 60%, and so looking at the demographics even within an actual country or nation can reveal some insights into the epidemiology. The lowest risk group are affluent Caucasians under the age of 40, and that's just a socio-economic thing. I'm not making any statements about these different ethnic groups, these different demographics, these different cultures. I'm just reporting the data as it is known by the CDC and the WHO. There have been a lot of studies that have not connected tobacco and alcohol consumption with infection with pylori. There is an elevated risk of infection when nutrition is inadequate. That's probably due to just general immune status. Diets rich in fruits, vegetables, specifically vitamin C, are believed to be protective against infection. Food that's prepared under less than ideal conditions or close to contaminated soil and or water increases the risk of infection. So you can understand here why in developing and third world countries, diet is poor, sanitation is poor, food preparation conditions are often less than ideal, and drinking water is often next to raw sewage, and food preparation areas are next to sewage outlets, etc., etc. And so in those developing countries, that is primarily why we see higher infection rates, and that will become obvious when we see the routes of transmission, which is coming up in a moment. So a fourth point here is just really to take a broad look at infection rates in the United States. This is actually one of my favorite diagrams from epidemiological studies, and you can bet your bottom dollar that there will be some questions on your quiz about this diagram, so make sure you understand how to read Venn diagrams. So let me kind of briefly explain the diagram. The green square here represents the total US population, and so if there's green, then you are Helicobacter pylori negative. So the rectangle is the total population, and the green shading is people who are Helicobacter pylori negative. That means that anybody who's in a circle is infected and is having some kind of disease or is not having disease. So that's just infected versus uninfected to start with. Now, if we look at the circle, which is the biggest circle here, and I'll just help you out. We're looking at this circle here, the duodenal ulcer circle. Okay, those are people who are infected with Helicobacter pylori and who develop duodenal ulcers. So of that circle, I'm just going to trace the outline of that circle. This proportion of this circle, those people have duodenal ulcers and they're Helicobacter pylori positive. Now, there is a small fraction which is outside here. It's really hard to trace. I'm not doing a very good job, I apologize. This part of the circle here, they have duodenal ulcers and are pylori negative, so there's something else going on in those folks. And then we've got a similar kind of thing going on down here. This part of the gastric ulcer circle are people who have gastric ulcers and do not have pylori infection, which means that the rest of the circle, or these people, have gastric ulcers and are HP positive. And then obviously this in here, bad job of scribbling with a mouse. All of these people in here are pylori positive, and they've got duodenal ulcers and they've got gastric ulcers. They are probably not very happy bunnies. And then you can see the same kind of thing going on down here. These people here have got gastric ulcers, and you can quite quickly see which ones have Helicobacter pylori and which ones don't. So, and then you've got an overlap with the gastric ulcer circle, and so that's these people in here. Those are people who've got gastric ulcers and gastric cancer. Obviously, probably not very happy people. So make sure you can and can interpret this diagram and explain what each of the shaded regions means. So that brings us to our last point here in epidemiology, and that's point number 5. And this all relates to routes of transmission. And as you can probably guess from the epidemiology of infection rates and correlations with socioeconomic status and developing and developed countries, the primary routes of transmission are oral, from mouth to mouth, vomitus to vomitus, that kind of thing. Fecal oral, so contaminated food. Obviously doesn't mean what you might think it might mean, but that is the contamination of food by fecal material by putting food preparation areas very close to food consumption areas. In developing countries, contaminated well water can be a route of transmission. There's some evidence suggesting that cats and cat fecal material can transmit pylori. That's probably not a major route of transmission. And there's some evidence indicating that houseflies can possibly transmit the pathogen. But again, that's probably not a major route of concern. Now, the only completely supported route of transmission is the iatrogenic route of transmission. So iatrogenic is just the transmission of the pathogen via endoscopy. So if you stick a bunch of pylori on the end of an endoscope and you stick it down someone's stomach, you're going to establish an infection, and that can be shown in animal models. So that's the only truly proven mechanism of transmission. So those are 5 points about epidemiology. Point number 1 was about the prevalence best correlating with socioeconomic status. The second point was the prevalence increasing with increasing age, and we talked about risk factors. And then point number 4, we looked at this Venn diagram you're looking at now. And then the last point is to talk about the transmission routes. And so the last thing we'll do in part 5 of this is we'll look at the treatments for Helicobacter pylori infection.